It is pretty crazy to think about all the different iterations of Batman that exist, starting from the black and white film era of Batman all the way to Adam West, and then eventually Michael Keaton, then he got swapped out for Val Kilmer, then he got swapped out for George Clooney, then later on, we got Christian Bale's Batman in the Dark Knight trilogy, and finally, we have Robert Pattinson in The Batman. I grew up with Adam West and Michael Keaton, and for me, Michael Keaton was the definitive Batman. Even after the Dark Knight trilogy, I'm like, no, Christian Bale doesn't hold a candle to Michael Keaton. Michael Keaton's the Batman. After seeing the initial ads of The Batman, I was feeling prepared to say the same thing even after seeing Robert Pattinson's performance. And I gotta say, I was wrong. You know, I've done this intro like 8 times, and I just realized I skipped completely over Ben Affleck's Batman every single time I've shot this intro. When we went from Tim Burton to Christopher Nolan, I think that we all collectively got the sense that Batman has become way more grounded, and it seemed to answer the question, what would it be like if Batman was real? What would that actually look like? And I personally feel like The Batman by Matt Reeves has actually gotten way closer to answering that question truthfully, genuinely, and without reservation. It's almost like Batman has just become progressively less campy over the years, starting again from the black and white film era to Adam West to Michael Keaton, just in terms of the overall vibe and aesthetic. And now with Matt Reeves' Batman, it's definitely absent of all campiness in favor of edge and grit and realism. Here's a brief non-spoiler overview. The Batman takes place in our Caped Crusader's younger days. Not quite back as far as Mask of the Phantasm shows us, where he's just beginning to sketch out what his costume looks like, but at this point in time, he's been established as a vigilante in Gotham City. The police department doesn't like him, but he's got one friend in law enforcement, and that's Commissioner Gordon. Speaking of whom, Commissioner Gordon brings him in on a crime to help solve. A high-level politician has been murdered, and Batman's got to figure out who did it and why. The Batman is about 3 hours long, and over the course of the film, we really get to deep dive into the psychology of Batman, who he is, where he comes from, and why he does what he does. For me, it's the first live-action instance of Batman where we really get to discover the griminess and corruptness of Gotham City in a way that no other Batman film that I'm aware of has ever shown us. As I said earlier, when we went from Tim Burton's Batman to Christopher Nolan's Batman, there was this sense of realism being brought to the franchise. And I feel like in Matt Reeves' iteration of Batman, that goal has been compounded hard. Everything from the way Batman behaves, the way people behave, the costumes, the vehicles, the outfits, the weapons, and of course the villains. This is so much closer to Batman IRL than any other iteration of Batman that we've seen so far.
I want you to tell all your friends about me.
What are you?
I'm Batman.
Like I said a moment ago, the movie's about 3 hours long, and so one of the first questions I wanted to answer for myself after coming out of the movie is, does it need to be 3 hours long? I'm not sure that it did, but I will say that I enjoyed all of it. Not to say that I didn't notice that it was 3 hours. It definitely felt like a 3-hour film because of the way that it's cut, because of the shots that were chosen. It's very deliberate in its choices. It takes its time. It's very much like a detective movie. With that, everything is sort of this uncovering of information slowly. In order to really bring us into this world, Matt Reeves, it seems, didn't want to rush anything, and he didn't. It really felt like you were part of this universe. You were really immersed in this place in Gotham City for 3 hours. So I would say that the pacing is kind of a double-edged sword in that way because I do feel the length of the movie, but I guess I didn't mind it so much because it felt like I really went on this journey with the Batman. As it stands right now in this moment, I can't think of anything off the top of my head that I'm like, yeah, that could have gone. We didn't need that. It could have been less movie. Wouldn't have had to hold my pee quite as long. One of the factors I mentioned a moment ago that kind of contributes to the feeling of the length is the way that it's shot. It wasn't a lot of fancy camera angles. It was more about just letting you be in this moment, letting the actors do their thing, and just kind of trusting in their performances, trusting that the stuff that you're looking at is interesting enough that you don't need to have all kinds of crazy camera angles and a whole bunch of edits. But the byproduct of that is it can feel longer. If you have more variety in your shots, if you have quicker edits, the film will move along a lot quicker, like a Christopher Nolan movie might. If you watch any of his movies, there's a lot of inserts and a lot of quick cuts, and this film definitely doesn't do that. This film is more like, let's just let you be there. And in the interest of completely deviating from anything Christopher Nolan has done, I think that's actually a pretty good move. It's different.
Can I persuade you to take a sandwich with you, sir?
I'll get drive-through.
Most of you already know that this version of Batman is totally different from Batman's before him, from his predecessors.
Hey, Mr. Wayne.
I'm sorry that I'm late. Now, where is Harvey?
It's one thing to read about it and see it in a trailer, that's short form. You're not really being exposed to it. It's an entirely different thing to watch it over the course of 3 hours. Now, I gotta admit, initially it was kind of jarring because I'm not used to this version of Batman. It's like, it takes a minute to acclimate, to get used to. For me, it did. For most of you, it probably won't. I grew to really, really like it, and it made sense to me as I watched the film, given everything around Bruce Wayne, given what he went through, given his experiences. It made a lot of sense for this young version of Batman / Bruce Wayne to behave the way that he does, to speak in the way that he does, than how we've seen him in other iterations. Robert Pattinson's version of Batman is way quieter in demeanor, way more emo, shall we say.
I don't care what happens to me.
Now, obviously, that's more specific to Bruce Wayne, but when he's donning the costume, which is actually a lot of the movie, his version of Batman is this foreboding, intimidating presence. There's just something about him, almost like watching a bad guy in a horror film. The way he walks and the way he looks at you, the way he enters the scene. He means to strike fear because fear is his tool, and I think that the film does a really, really good job of conveying that. The one interesting thing, though, is when Robert Pattinson's Batman gets angry, he does sound a little bit like Christian Bale's Batman, but Robert Pattinson's Batman is still clear and enunciates everything he says. There was not one instance where I couldn't understand what Robert Pattinson was saying.
I'm not wearing hockey masks.
Like I hinted at earlier, this depiction of Batman might be my new favorite Batman, and that is extremely surprising to me. I think one of the things that really helps in this depiction of Batman is that this one feels the most personal of all the other ones that we've ever experienced. Between the narration and what we spend time on, what Batman decides to focus on, what he's obsessed with, all of these things culminate in making a Batman that feels so three-dimensional in a way that I've never experienced before. The only other version of Batman that I can think of that maybe comes close to making me feel the way I did here is Batman Mask of the Phantasm. The way that this film was shot is definitely on the darker side. I've talked about that before with the trailer reactions. It's unlike the way we have seen Batman portrayed in the past, because in the Tim Burton Batman, it's more lit up, even though it's a darker Batman, taking notes, inspirations from the Dark Knight comic books. So with Batman Begins, we had another iteration of going even darker, and in this one is definitely the darkest in terms of the overall look of it. So what they crafted here was definitely a neo-noir, very grimy sort of vibe through the tonality of the colors, the costumes and whatnot. So the feeling that you get, the feeling that you achieve here is something like Zodiac or Seven, and so this version of Gotham City definitely feels more uncomfortable and gross compared to previous iterations of Gotham City. I think I'd say that across the board, the acting was pretty strong in this film. There were two exceptions, and that's two actors who were playing two cops. The only reason they stood out to me is because their vocal quality was odd, and it was almost goofy sounding. I think I even heard like audience members laughing at the second cop I'm thinking of. I'm not gonna mention who I'm talking about in case you guys don't notice. All the other actors, all the other cast members did a great job of making me feel like I was just watching people, not actors, who were from Gotham City, who were part of this. So I have the IMDb here in front of me. Zoe Kravitz as Catwoman. I got no complaints. I thought she did a really good job. There was nothing in her performance where I was like, oh my god, that's remarkable, so amazing. But I thought she did a really good job of bringing Catwoman to life. I mean, I enjoyed it. I have literally nothing bad to say about it. Paul Dano as Riddler. I mean, what a villain, dude. I think this might be my favorite performance from Paul Dano. It rivals his performance in There Will Be Blood. He did a fantastic job. I mean, he stood out. Colin Farrell as the Penguin. I mean, goddamn, that is definitely a remarkable performance. Colin Farrell as Oswald Cobblepot might be my favorite performance in the movie. I think it's damn near worthy of an Oscar nomination. It should get an Oscar nomination as a supporting actor. He completely disappeared into this role. He's unrecognizable, and you buy him as the Penguin. I don't know that it's as surprising as Heath Ledger doing the Joker, but it's definitely surprising. It's definitely one of those things where you're like, wait, who? That's Colin Farrell? And of course we got Andy Serkis as Alfred. I think he did a good job as Alfred. Given that Alfred is not like a character like, you know, the Penguin, it's different from anything else we've seen him do before. And in that regard, in terms of comparison, I thought, oh, cool, yeah, Andy Serkis definitely, I mean, we know he's got range, but in terms of seeing him do this character that's just more, I guess, normal, I thought he did a nice job of being that support to Bruce Wayne. And then of course we got Jeffrey Wright as James Gordon. The funniest thing happened to me while I was watching him in the movie, which is I felt like he looked so much like James Gordon. And typically James Gordon is white, but like just watching him, I'm like, wow. When I think of James Gordon, I think of James Gordon from Batman the Animated Series. And when I was watching Jeffrey Wright here, I'm like, that's totally James Gordon. Now, obviously, the performances aren't just created by the actors, it's also helped by the director and his direction, where he puts the camera, how he accents whatever the actor is trying to convey. And in that regard, I thought that Matt Reeves did a really, really brave thing here, which is he didn't do a heck of a lot with the camera. He was more so just kind of locking it off and just allowing the actors to act, allowing the actors to do their thing. And you don't get that all that often in films in this particular genre. The only other instance I can think of that we maybe got it is obviously The Joker, where it was really focused on the performances and the character development and whatnot. And so with that in mind, I thought Matt Reeves did a great job of allowing the actors to act and pulling out those performances. Like I said, there wasn't a whole lot of coverage. There wasn't a lot of crazy camera angles. It's like, okay, we're just gonna get it from here, get it from here. Let's let the actors play and do their thing and really bring out those emotions. Matt Reeves really deserves credit not just for bringing this iteration of Batman to life, but allowing the space, fostering the environment for these actors to do their thing at their best.
I'll look into it.
When we think about Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy, one of the things that we remember is how amazing the action was. But we also simultaneously remember how bad the fight scenes were. The action and the fight scenes in here were actually quite strong. Now, the action, I don't think compares to Christopher Nolan's trilogy. It's not trying to be that. It's not trying to do that. This is more a grounded detective movie, whereas the Dark Knight trilogy is more of this epic spectacle. Now, don't get me wrong, there are epic moments that happen within the Batman.
I got you! I got you!
But I think most of the epicness just comes from an emotional place. It's hard to really convey that without giving anything away, so I won't. I think that the overall emotional payoff of what I experienced in the Batman actually surpasses whatever I experienced in the Dark Knight trilogy. Now, talking specifically about the fight scenes definitely surpass the Christopher Nolan trilogy in that, you know, you really can see what's happening. It's not like marred and messed up camera angles. There were some instances where I was like, okay, you could have used more coverage there and cut away or something like that because you had a bad guy just sort of standing there waiting to get hit. I would say for like 75-80% of the fight scenes in the movie, they were strong, they were visceral. The camera was getting in there when it needed to, but it was mostly, just like with the acting, allowing the action to just be. And what that affords you is two things. You can see the action, and it also feels a little bit more horrifying, like you're there watching this happen. It's very counterintuitive to how fight scenes are generally shot these days. Like, you can see like one or two of them in the ads where the camera's just like letting the action play out. And it may not seem like it, but that's actually way more complicated to do than your average fight scene because the actor has to go through this whole thing and rehearse and rehearse and rehearse. And you can see that it's the actor, it's Robert Pattinson. It's not a stand-in, it's not a double. I mean, I'm sure they use doubles, but in these particular shots that I'm thinking of, you saw that it was him. And so from the standpoint of the idea, I loved it. I thought it was awesome. I really, really liked what they were going for. In terms of the execution, like I said, 75-80% of the time, it was definitely there. And there was a handful of instances where I was like, oh, that bad guy was stalling, he was waiting to take that hit, and the timing was a little bit off. Maybe if they got coverage, they would have been able to, you know, save that. It wouldn't be so obvious that the bad guy was just waiting. But again, I must emphasize, like, 75-80% of the time, I was so into it. I was just loving it. I was cheering. Overall, the fight scenes really helped to serve the story, which should, generally speaking, be the goal. I know that you have movies like The Raid where the fight scenes are the point, but in a film like this, the fight scenes have to serve the narrative, and I think they really did that. So throughout this video, I've done a lot of comparing of the Batman to previous iterations of Batman, and I think that if I were to rank this, it might be my favorite Batman story, my favorite depiction of Batman. But in terms of rewatchability, I think that the Christopher Nolan films are still more rewatchable for me personally. I think that because of the spectacle of the Dark Knight trilogy, it's more of a fun experience to go back to and watch again on your big screen and whatnot. Whereas the Batman is more of this atmospheric, moody film that is kind of like Seven. It's like a detective movie, and so I don't know how many times I want to go back and watch Seven over and over and over again. It's unsettling and psychological, and that is fun in its own right, but it's not the same kind of fun as like a Transformers movie, which I feel like the Dark Knight trilogy is closer to on that spectrum. I know that's a weird way to interpret it, but I think you guys get what I'm saying. Would I go back and watch the Batman? Certainly. I'm gonna go back and watch it. I'm gonna go back and watch it in IMAX. It's gonna be fun to watch it in IMAX, but it's not really that kind of movie, if that makes any sense, whereas the Nolan films are. So in terms of fun spectacle, I would say the Nolan films are still champion, but in terms of creating the most interesting Batman ever, I think Matt Reeves has certainly nailed it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this review. It was definitely different and experimental in the way that I decided to shoot it and edit it. I hope that the end result was pleasant. Either way, you guys, thanks for hanging out. Please hit the subscribe button, bell icon, all notifications, and vote this up so that YouTube know you enjoyed what you watched. Thanks again. I'm Jaby Koay. Peace out.